It was the worst ever offshore oil disaster. But people started getting sick, and then people started dying. Now, this environmental disaster has become a health catastrophe.
When the oil tanker MT Solar One sank in Philippine waters in 2006, nearly 500,000 gallons of toxic bunker fuel spilled into fragile marine ecosystems.
5 years later, oil is still coming ashore here and will continue to come ashore here as scientists have found immense tar balls and oil still remaining at the bottom of the Gulf.
Coral reefs suffocated, mangroves drowned in sludge, and fishing communities lost everything.
We even had some rare and endangered birds that were actually nesting out here, and today, nothing. They're all gone.
As conventional cleanup efforts failed and desperation mounted, a startlingly simple and controversial solution emerged. Thousands of tons of coconut peel was dumped into the sea. No one expected what happened next. Catastrophe unleashed. The devastation of MT Solar One. In the early hours of August 11, 2006, the MT Solar One vanished into the depths off the coast of Guimaras Island. The tanker was old, battered by years at sea, and loaded to the brim with hundreds of thousands of gallons of heavy bunker oil for Petron Corporation. As it sank nearly 3,000 feet, the tanker spilled 550,000 gallons of thick black sludge into the water. What followed was not slow or distant. It was immediate, violent, and overwhelming. Within hours, the sea turned black. Heavy oil spread, driven by currents and waves, slammed into the shoreline like a living force. About 3,700 acres of coast were swallowed by sticky sludge. Beaches vanished under layers of tar. The water lost its shine and became thick and suffocating. Coral reefs that had taken hundreds of years to grow were buried alive. Mangroves, which protect shorelines and serve as nurseries for fish, were coated until their roots could no longer breathe. Seagrass beds, which hold sand in place and feed marine animals, collapsed under the weight of oil. The Taklong Marine Reserve was hit especially hard. This protected area had once been a safe place for fish, turtles, and countless small sea creatures. After the spill, it became a graveyard. Baby sea turtles surfaced for air and inhaled oil instead. Many suffocated before they could reach clean water. Fish swam blindly through poisoned seas until their bodies shut down. Their lifeless forms soon floated to the surface and washed ashore, piling up near villages that depended on them to survive. Even the smallest forms of life were erased. Microbes that help break down waste and support the food web collapsed. Without them, parts of the sea turned into dead zones where nothing could survive. And the damage did not stop with wildlife. Human life along the coast fell apart almost overnight. Authorities had no choice but to ban all fishing. The water was too dangerous. The fish were poisoned. About 20,000 fishermen instantly lost their only source of income. These were families who lived day to day, earning just barely enough to eat and send their children to school. With fishing forbidden, money disappeared. Food became scarce. Parents were forced to pull children out of school because they could no longer afford supplies or transport. Fear replaced routine. Hunger replaced stability. Tourism collapsed just as fast. Guimaras had been known for its clean beaches and clear waters. After the spill, those beaches were covered in black sludge that stuck to skin and clothes. The smell of oil hung in the air and made people sick. Visitors stopped coming. Small hotels closed. Boat operators lost work. Vendors who sold food and souvenirs had no customers. An entire local economy shut down in a matter of days. The financial damage reached billions of pesos, but the numbers failed to capture the true cost. Families were displaced. Some people left their homes to look for work elsewhere. Others stayed and watched their way of life crumble. Stress and fear spread through communities already dealing with loss. People did not know when the sea would recover or if it ever would. The future felt stolen by the oil spill. The scale of the disaster stunned everyone. Local leaders were overwhelmed. Cleanup crews were unprepared for a spill of this size. International observers looked on in shock as images of blackened shores and dying wildlife spread across the world. The spill exposed a brutal truth. An oil spill is not just a pollution problem. It is a chain reaction that tears through nature and human life at the same time. It destroys food, work, safety, and hope with terrifying speed. As scientists, officials, and local residents walked through the wreckage, the same question kept rising. How can anyone fix a damage this severe? Can mangroves be brought back? Can coral reefs recover? Can families survive long enough to see the sea heal? Time was running out. Every day without answers meant more loss. That growing desperation set the stage for a bold and risky attempt to repair what had been broken. It was an effort driven by urgency and by the knowledge that failure would mean permanent ruin. When technology fails, the limits of conventional cleanup. Within days of the spill, the Filipino authorities launched every cleanup method known around the world. Floating barriers were rushed into the water to trap the oil before it spread. Mechanical machines designed to skim oil from the surface were deployed. Absorbent pads were laid across beaches and shallow waters. Chemical dispersants were sprayed from boats and aircraft in an attempt to break the oil apart. On paper, this was the full response playbook used in major oil disasters. But in reality, the sea did not cooperate. The oil released from the MT Solar One was bunker oil, one of the heaviest and dirtiest fuels used in shipping. This was not light oil that stayed on the surface and could be swept away. It was thick, sticky, and slow-moving. Once it reached land, it wrapped itself around mangrove roots and hardened like glue. It seeped into sand and locked itself between rocks. Instead of spreading evenly, it formed dense black sheets that refused to break apart. Every attempt to lift it only smeared it further. Floating barriers failed almost at once. Strong waves and shifting currents pushed oil beneath them or ripped them apart entirely. Mechanical skimmers were just as useless. Their intake systems clogged within minutes because the oil was too thick to flow. Crews had to stop constantly to clear machines that barely worked at all. Absorbent mats filled up fast and became heavy and unmanageable. Once soaked, they added to the waste problem and offered little real progress. Chemical dispersants made the situation worse. These chemicals are meant to break oil into smaller droplets so it can sink and be broken down naturally. But in Guimaras, this did not solve the problem. The oil did not disappear. It simply spread wider and deeper. Toxic chemicals mixed with toxic oil, poisoning water that had not yet been touched. Fish and small sea life were exposed to an even deadlier mixture. What was meant to reduce damage only expanded it. The location of the disaster made everything harder. Guimaras is an island with limited access. Roads were narrow and poorly equipped for heavy equipment. Ports were small and could not handle large response vessels. There were no nearby facilities with the machines needed for a spill of this size. Specialized ships from wealthier countries were days or weeks away, and by the time they arrived, much of the damage was already done. International help was also slowed by paperwork and delays. Permissions had to be approved, equipment had to be cleared. Time slipped away while the oil kept spreading. In the meantime, local residents were pushed to the front lines. Fishermen, farmers, students, and volunteers waded into polluted waters with no proper protection. They used buckets, shovels, and their bare hands to scoop oil from beaches and mangroves. Many became sick from fumes and direct contact. They risked their health because there was no other choice. The failure of every major cleanup tool revealed a brutal truth. These systems were designed for places with money, access, and strong infrastructure. In remote and developing regions, they often fail completely. Technology alone could not save Guimaras. The disaster was bigger than machines. As the days passed and the damage deepened, frustration turned into fear. Scientists and officials were forced to admit that their plans were not enough. If metal tools and chemical solutions could not stop the destruction, something else had to be tried. So attention began to shift toward the natural world itself for the solution. The first unconventional attempts: hair as an oil magnet. When every machine failed and every official plan collapsed, people reached for something no one had ever taken seriously before. In the middle of fear, anger, and exhaustion, Filipinos turned to human hair. The idea sounded almost absurd at first. Hair was not a chemical, it was not a machine, it was not something listed in any official disaster response manual. Yet the science behind it was simple and clear. Human hair naturally pushes water away while pulling oil toward it. Each thin strand has a rough surface that grabs oil and holds it very tight. When thousands of strands are packed together, they act like a powerful sponge designed for oil alone. Word spread quickly across the country. Hair salons, barbershops, schools, and community centers became collection points. Bags of hair piled up in streets and gymnasiums. Hair that would normally be thrown away was suddenly treated like precious material. Volunteers stuffed the hair into mesh nets, tied them closed, and shaped them into long floating barriers. These homemade booms were then laid carefully along polluted shorelines, mangroves, and shallow waters where oil was thickest. Once placed in the water, the results were shocking. The hair booms floated steadily without sinking. As oil drifted toward them, it stuck fast and stayed there. Cleanup teams could lift the booms and physically remove the oil instead of watching it spread. Tests showed that about 25,000 pounds of hair could absorb as much as 170,000 gallons of oil. For a community with few resources, this was a breakthrough that felt almost impossible. The success was not just technical, it was deeply human. Students skipped classes to help pack hair. Hairdressers worked overtime to collect more. Fishermen who had lost their livelihoods joined cleanup crews. People who felt helpless days earlier were now part of the response. Desperation turned into a movement. Fear turned into action. For the first time since the spill, many felt they were fighting back. Still, the solution was not perfect. Hair breaks down slowly in the environment. Some donated hair carried dyes, sprays, and chemical treatments that could harm marine life over time. The booms worked best as a short-term fix, not a permanent answer. Scientists knew that relying on hair alone would not be enough for massive spills or long-term recovery. Even so, the experiment changed everything. It proved that solutions did not have to come from expensive labs or foreign machines. They could come from ordinary people and ordinary waste. It forced experts to rethink what counted as a resource. That realization pushed the search further. If hair could trap oil, what else could? The Philippines produces huge amounts of agricultural waste every year, much of it burned or discarded. Scientists began to look at these materials with new eyes. Hidden in fields and farms was the possibility of something stronger, cleaner, and more abundant. The next step would go deeper into nature itself, and toward a solution rooted in what the country already had in vast supply. Searching nature's toolbox plant fibers and agricultural byproducts, researchers began testing plant fibers and agricultural byproducts one by one. Straw left over after harvest was examined closely. Coconut husks, already common waste in the Philippines, were shredded and studied. Other fibrous plant remains were collected from farms and processing sites. Each material was tested for how dense it was, how well it trapped oil inside tiny surface gaps, and how long it could float without falling apart. These tiny gaps, known as microcapillary structures, act like narrow channels that pull oil inward and hold it there. The stronger and more numerous these channels were, the better the material performed. The results stunned even experienced researchers. Many of these natural fibers absorbed oil more efficiently than synthetic sponges and commercial booms used around the world. Instead of sinking, they stayed afloat for days, even in rough water. They did not break into harmful fragments. Unlike plastic-based products, they left no microplastics behind, which are tiny particles that poison fish and enter the food chain. This meant the cleanup itself did not create a second disaster. Even more unexpected benefits began to appear. Some plant fibers did more than trap oil. They also pulled heavy metals out of polluted water. These metals come from fuel, ship paint, and industrial waste and can remain toxic for decades. By absorbing both oil and metals, these fibers offered a deeper level of cleanup that traditional tools could not achieve. This research forced a major shift in thinking. Materials once treated as useless trash were suddenly recognized as powerful tools. Farm waste that had been burned or dumped now had value. Communities did not need to wait for foreign equipment or expensive imports. They could gather these materials themselves, prepare them locally, and deploy them quickly. This meant faster response times and new sources of income for people who had lost everything to the spill. Among all the fibers tested, one stood out for its combination of abundance, durability, and oil-attracting ability. Scientists began focusing on it, unaware that its potential would soon stun scientists and change the way oil spills were managed. Its discovery marked the critical turning point, where simple waste would become a global game-changer. Coconut husks, the forgotten treasure. For decades, millions of tons of coconut husks in the Philippines had been largely ignored. While coconut water, meat, oil, and leaves were turned into commercial products, the fibrous husk, which makes up nearly 35% of the fruit's weight, was simply discarded. People treated it as waste. Farmers left it to rot, burn, or pile up in fields, never realizing its hidden potential. Historical records, however, showed that during World War II, coconut husks had been put to critical use. They were woven into life jackets that saved countless lives at sea, used in anchor nets to secure ships, and even employed for camouflage. Despite these practical applications, modern industry completely overlooked this versatile material, leaving it buried in plain sight. When scientists finally began testing the husks in the wake of the MT Solar One oil spill, the results were astonishing. Coconut fiber, also called coir, has a natural affinity for oil and resists water at the same time. Its twisted, spongy fibers are filled with millions of microcapillaries, which are tiny channels capable of pulling oil inside and trapping it. Once the oil is absorbed, the fibers float on the surface without sinking, making it easy for cleanup teams to collect the oil. Unlike human hair, which had been a temporary and small-scale fix, coir is abundant, inexpensive, and fully biodegradable. It breaks down safely over time without leaving toxic residues, microplastics, or long-term pollutants behind. The discovery went beyond environmental impact. It created a remarkable economic opportunity. Farmers who had previously discarded husks could now sell them to local processing centers, creating a new source of income. Processing plants could convert these fibers into oil-absorbing booms, mats, and pads, producing materials that could be deployed quickly along affected coastlines. Entire communities could participate, collecting, cleaning, and bundling fibers, turning ordinary labor into life-saving work. What had been treated as worthless waste suddenly became a valuable commodity, tripling the economic value of materials that had long been ignored. For communities devastated by the spill, this meant that cleanup was no longer dependent on expensive foreign machinery, slow bureaucratic responses, or chemicals that had only worsened the problem. Beyond economics, coir represented hope and resilience. Men, women, students, and fishermen could all take part in the cleanup, reclaiming some control over the disaster that had stolen their livelihoods. The material could be applied to mangroves, beaches, shallow reefs, and other vulnerable areas, providing direct protection to ecosystems while simultaneously restoring human communities. Unlike machines that clogged, sank, or broke under the weight of heavy oil, coconut husks were flexible, durable, and reliable. They were renewable, available in enormous quantities, and capable of operating without complex infrastructure, making them perfect for disaster response in remote and developing regions. Coconut husks had quickly transformed from a forgotten trash into a revolutionary tool. They were not just a substitute for conventional methods, they combined local labor, abundant natural resources, and ecological restoration in one simple, effective system. They offered a scalable, practical, and environmentally safe solution, demonstrating that even ordinary materials could become extraordinary tools in the face of catastrophe. Now the world was about to witness the most dramatic test of coir's full potential. They dumped thousands of tons of coconut peel. The results stunned scientists. The defining moment finally came during the 2023 oil spill off Bataan, where 370,000 gallons of industrial fuel threatened fish farms, mangroves, coral reefs, and entire coastal communities. Authorities understood that they had to act quickly to prevent irreversible destruction to both the environment and the livelihoods of thousands of people. When they finally approved the use of coconut husks on a massive scale, even the scientists overseeing the response approached the plan with cautious skepticism. On paper, it sounded almost impossible. The idea required gathering enormous quantities of agricultural waste, drying it carefully in the sun, mechanically shredding it into fibers, tying the fibers into floating bundles, and dropping thousands of tons directly into an oil spill that had resisted weeks of industrial cleanup. Yet desperation leaves no room for hesitation. Trucks began arriving from coconut farms across the region, carrying mountains of husks that had once been burned or left to rot in fields. The husks were carefully sun-dried to strengthen their natural ability to attract oil. Then they were mechanically separated into coarse coir fibers and packed into long, flexible booms using fully biodegradable netting. Additional fibers were left loose and shaped into mats that could be lowered precisely into mangroves, tidal flats, and coral shallows where machines could never reach. Deployment began at first light. Boats laid the first lines of coconut booms along the outer edge of the spill, forming a natural containment barrier. More booms were placed closer to shore, surrounding fish farms, mangrove forests, and areas critical for the survival of marine life. Teams worked meticulously to place loose coir directly onto oil-coated reefs and roots, pressing the fibers into thick black sludge to ensure full contact. The results were immediate and astonishing. Within hours, oil that had clung stubbornly to rocks, coral, and mangroves for weeks began to lift, detach, and move as if drawn by an invisible force. The coconut fibers did not merely break up or scatter the oil, they absorbed it completely. Scientists later confirmed that the high lignin content and microcapillary structure of coir acted like millions of tiny magnets for hydrocarbons, pulling oil into the fibers while repelling water. The fibers remained afloat even when fully saturated, allowing teams to remove oil with remarkable efficiency. By the end of the first day, treated areas showed dramatic reductions in surface oil. Within 72 hours, some zones had lost nearly 90% of visible contamination. This was an astonishing result that stunned scientists worldwide, as all other conventional methods had failed to achieve the same feat, even after weeks of effort. Sunlight returned to seagrass beds. Mangrove leaves resumed oxygen exchange, preventing mass die-offs. Fish cautiously returned to the shallows, first in small numbers and then in growing schools. Fishermen who had prepared for months of unemployment were able to resume limited work far earlier than anyone had predicted. The benefits extended beyond the water. Local clinics reported fewer cases of oil-related skin burns and respiratory illnesses because chemical dispersants were never used. The saturated coconut fibers were not discarded. Many were squeezed and redeployed multiple times, while others were processed into fuel briquettes, construction additives, or treated and returned to land as soil conditioners. The cleanup created no secondary waste crisis. Instead, it formed a closed-loop system in which pollution was captured, removed, and repurposed, turning disaster into opportunity. In the months that followed, long-term effects became impossible to ignore. Preserved mangroves stabilized coastlines and protected nearby farms from erosion. Fish populations rebounded faster than expected because critical breeding grounds survived. Beaches reopened months earlier than anticipated, reviving tourism and saving countless small businesses from collapse. Coconut farmers gained an entirely new source of income, selling husks that had once been worthless. Cleanup costs dropped dramatically, not because corners were cut, but because the solution was local, abundant, and aligned with nature rather than fighting against it. Perhaps the most profound change occurred among the scientists themselves. Many openly admitted that they had spent decades designing machines to solve a problem that nature already had a viable solution for. An environmental disaster caused by industrial fuel had been undone not by more industry, but by agricultural waste, community labor, and a deep understanding of natural chemistry. As the last blackened water cleared and life quietly returned, the success of coconut husks proved that sometimes the simplest materials, understood and used correctly, could achieve what machines and chemicals could not. It was a moment of triumph born from desperation, ingenuity, and the enduring power of nature. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.